Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Diving Deeper conversation. My name is Dr. Ifad Zaidan Hatoum, Director of General Education in the Online and Professional Studies Division at CBU. And I'm currently serving on the ASA American Scientific Affiliation local CBU local chapter alongside Dr. Thomas Furco, who is the Associate Dean of the Division of Natural and Mathematical Sciences at CBU. And along as well, two wonderful student leaders who have been amazingly proactive in planning this event from A to Z. Audrey Alexander and Kabrina Balls, thank you for all your hard work. I would like now to introduce our speakers for the event today, Dr. Patrick Schott, Associate Professor of Biochemistry and Department Chair of Chemical Sciences at California Baptist University. Dr. Ricardo Cordero Soto, who is an associate professor of mathematics, as well as the chair of the department in applied mathematics. We are so glad that you could be here with us today to share your perspectives on science and faith, and also answer questions related to the topic. Thank you very much for joining.
With us, I pray that you give them the words that they need to say, and just that this would go very well. So I thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Kabrina. Perhaps I can start with Dr. Schott. Can you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background, a fun fact about yourself, your hobbies, and then Dr. Cordero could introduce himself, and then we can move on to our specific questions for the session. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So, like I said, my name is Dr. Schott, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to present on this and chat on this, and definitely echo the sentiments that we started, that we want this to be a dialogue, not a lecture, where they started out with, I think, some questions the students put together of some good, really good, actually, starting questions to get that conversation going. But please continue to add your own questions to it. We want this to be something that's engaging and involved, not just a lecture where we're going to talk at you for an hour. With that said, I am Associate Professor of Biochemistry and also the Chair of the Chemical Sciences Department, as was said. My background from an educational standpoint, I did my undergraduate at Biola University, where I majored in biochemistry and also minored in biblical studies. Had a strong interest in apologetics there, and also went through their Torrey Honors Institute, which was a great books program. So instead of taking a history or an English or a psychology class, first day of class, we read the entire Iliad. And then the next day of class, we had read the entire Odyssey. We were reading probably between 200 and 500 pages a week to go through that class and go through classical philosophy and literature and apologetics and all the way through all those ideas, and great thinkers in church history as well. So that deeply influenced the way I try to think across disciplines as opposed to siloed within a singular discipline, because that's the way education was presented to me at that undergraduate level. Also then for my graduate school, that's actually what brought me out to the Riverside area. I went to UCR and got a PhD in genetics, genomics, and bioinformatics. Now, most people have no idea what that means. Basically, what that means is using computers to process biological information. So looking at things like DNA sequences and protein structures and those types of things, and doing some of the work in the computer so that you can make predictions based on what you know there and save a little bit of the lab research before you go there. And then as I finished my PhD there, I started teaching here at CBU, and I've just really loved the opportunity here. In terms of a little bit of fun facts about me or hobbies there, for me, I grew up in San Diego and I loved snorkeling. Being at the beach was like the best thing ever. So we would go all the time. And later in high school, my brother and I got into spearfishing, actually, and have enjoyed that. It's been a few years since we've been able to go do that, but I still try to snorkel every now and again. And even in high school, I remember the best day we had out there, I got a halibut, my brother got a small shark, and came home and cooked these all up. And spearfishing is something that we keep talking about. When are we going to go back and do that again? But I have 4 kids. My brother has 4 kids. We're not really in a position to be doing that as much as we once did. In terms of hobbies that I still get to do today, though, with those kids, I love photography. And any opportunity to do that, usually going out to Yosemite, we usually spend at least 2 or 3 weeks, if not a month, in Yosemite every year. And a lot of that is hiking around doing photography, and then of course photography of the kids as well. So that would be a little bit about me. I guess one other thing there for fun is if you come into my office, you'll see lots of toys, not because they're my kids' toys, but because I have Lego sets of Star Wars Legos and other Star Wars sci-fi stuff. So Ricardo and I get along very well on that, and that we're always comparing, hey, check out this one I got here. And I'll go, oh, that's a cool new one you got there. So we have similar interest on that sci-fi genre as well. So that's a little bit about me on a more informal level. And I look forward to getting to know some about you guys as we go through as well.
Thank you for your introduction, Dr. Schott. We love the beach as well. And hopefully now with everything coming down, we can really get to enjoy that again. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Cordero, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Well, first thing I want to mention, and this is probably my mistake because I should have caught it before in the flyer. I've been the applied mathematics master's, or the master in applied mathematics. I've been the director for that till December, but currently we are in undergoing a transition in the department, and so I'm going to be moving into another role soon. And because of that, now Dr. Robert Willett is the director of the Applied Mathematics Masters. I'll be moving into chair of the Department of Mathematical Sciences come July. Anyway, my name is Ricardo Cordero Soto, if you say it with the very Anglican pronunciation. If you say it with my original hometown pronunciation, you would say Cordero Soto. I was born and raised in the island of Puerto Rico, which is an island in the Caribbean, 100 miles long, 35 miles wide, more or less. It sounds like it's really small, but for many years, it was, I would say, overpopulated with close to 4.5 million people during its height. Now it's, ever since a few things that have happened on the island, unfortunately, a hurricane in 2017, population has decreased a bit. My mom is the only one that's still there in the island of Puerto Rico. Most of my sisters have moved out, or all of my sisters actually have moved out of Puerto Rico. So I lived there until I finished my undergraduate degree. And when I finished my undergraduate degree in mathematics at a secular university, I went to another secular university in Arizona State University. And there is where I worked on my PhD in applied mathematics for the life and social sciences. It's a long name, but that's what my PhD is. My thesis and my work at the time was on time-dependent Schrodinger equations. These are the equations that are typically utilized, or more broadly speaking, a Schrodinger equation is kind of the heartbeat of modeling in quantum mechanics. I focused on something a little bit more mathematical, so kind of in between pure and applied math. But I've always been very fascinated by the quantum world, and in particular because of its implications and its relationship to, I think, good arguments for God's existence. I'll talk about that a little more later. I grew up a Catholic. My family was Catholic. They weren't, I would say my grandmothers were practicing Catholics. One of them in particular was very much a devout practicing Catholic. And I was a practicing Catholic growing up just because I wanted to. And then at some point, I guess you could say that I've transitioned into a non-denominational Christian, which is a very broad label and can mean a lot of different things because some people say there's no such thing as a non-denominational Christian. But yeah, I'm very mainstream, I would say, in terms of my evangelical or Christian beliefs. And fun fact about myself, well, Patrick hinted at one of them. You can see Captain America behind me, kind of there, a small little poster. I have an Iron Man poster in front of me, another one over here. I have, instead of a California Republic flag there, that's the Galactic Republic flag. And a few Funko Pop behind me there with all things ranging from Marvel to Stranger Things to Lord of the Rings to Star Wars. The child Grogu from the Mandalorian series is up there as well. And I have a TIE Fighter helmet over there. But anyway, I'm geeking out too much. I love Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and a lot of other things.
Thank you for a wonderful introduction. We're so happy that both of you could join us and open the conversation and the dialogue. I would like to start with my first question, and then please feel free to add your questions, and let's carry out the conversation. Perhaps the first question that I would like to ask Dr. Schott and Dr. Cordero Soto is, how does your field of study reveal the nature of God, and how do you really, how can you really intersect faith into your work and into your area of discipline, or your specific area and your discipline?
Patrick, you want to go first, or you want me to go first? I'll leave it up to you. Okay. Historically, I think it's the first thing that we need to understand is that there was a historical relationship between mathematics and faith. Like many of the natural sciences, the mathematical sciences were very much historically related to Christians. In particular, if you look at the 16th, 17th, 18th century mathematicians, they all viewed the world as being designed mathematically. They had kind of taken the idea from the Greeks that the universe was, in a sense, very mathematical, almost inherently mathematical. They ran that idea, but through their eyes of faith, through the eyes of their faith. And in doing so, you have quotes from people like Johannes Kepler, who says that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world is to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God. That's one example. Or you have people like, say, Blaise Pascal, who says that the chief aim, right, of investigating in science and mathematics is to, in a sense, discover the presence of God and his glory. And you continue along the list. Newton was an Anglican. He also saw the universe as designed mathematically. Galileo also was a devout Catholic. Unfortunately, he's kind of the first victim of persecution, nonetheless, by the church in a sense. And so that I like to say that that's first blood between the history of the conflict between faith and science, because he was a devout believer. And you can, again, there's just a broad list. Historically, mathematicians, many of the great mathematicians were Christians. Now, the second thing, and I'll end with this, is that how does this, how do I view it today, not just historically? I'm interested philosophically in an important question, which is, why is the universe so mathematical? Sounds like a simple question. And in short, secular perspectives have answered typically by saying, well, because mathematics is just the way that humans have invented. You could say it's a method that we've invented to process reality, understand reality, structure reality, study it. But there are some instances in which the application of mathematics go beyond just copying what we see in reality. And it gets into really disturbing territory, I would say, for the naturalist or atheist. And so then the question remains, can naturalism provide a good answer to why the universe is so mathematical? I would say inherently mathematical in some cases. And so I think that is one of the most important questions today for people to answer, because mathematics is utilized by most, if not all, of the natural sciences. So that's how kind of I approach my field and faith.
Awesome. Yeah. I wanted Ricardo to go, or Dr. Cordero to go first, because math and physics are really a foundation for chemistry and biology. So I thought it was a very appropriate direction to start at the foundation. And I find a lot of evidence in similar things to what he said there, of origin of the universe and mathematical organization of the universe, things like this. I was actually a very slow convert to his last point. I remember we had many conversations and even not heated discussions, but wait, but what about evidence for this? What about evidence for that regarding the the unusual effectiveness of mathematics to describe reality? And as I dug into it more, it's just an amazing point. I'd encourage people to follow up on that as well, as a great resource from a purely mathematical application towards evidence of life, of a creator. From my field specifically, my main work revolves around DNA and genetics. So two that directly come to mind would be looking at both the origin of life and the complexity of life. And when we look at origin of life, there's not that many theories that actually exist. Really, we should call them hypotheses that exist of how you could have gotten a first replicating system. But probably the best one to date for a naturalistic explanation of that would be the RNA world hypothesis. And actually, you get to teach on that topic specifically in my biochemistry and bioinformatics courses. And when we look at those, beyond the fact that there is no actual RNA that can do what they try to say it could do for this originating system, even if hypothetically it could exist, the odds of one of these occurring in the entire history of the universe, if you grant Big Bang cosmology and a 13.7 billion year universe, and you assume every molecule in the universe is nothing but the nucleotides you need to make these RNAs, the odds of getting that in the history of the universe by chance are less than 1 in 10 to the 100th power. So you look at this, and the way I often relate this to my students is comparing them to royal flushes in poker. And I'll say, if I were playing poker with you and I drew a royal flush, you might be a little suspicious. If I draw 2 in a row, you're pretty sure I'm cheating. If I draw 3 in a row, you know I'm cheating. To do this would be worse than drawing 10 royal flushes in a row. And everyone would look at that and say, there is no way that is a chance event. That is absolutely an intelligent individual manipulating the situation. And here statistically is something far beyond what we would ever accept chance as an explanation of. And only a creator would make sense, only an intelligence to put in that amount of information. You get a similar issue when you look at the actual complexity of biological systems today, and you apply that with the known rates of mutation. What we look at for biological evolution, we've been able to identify actually for decades through analyzing bacterial evolution to looking at human populations and many other techniques. We've identified that within the history of life on our planet, you could expect that in any given generation, you could accomplish 2 or at most 3 mutations in a single generation by pure chance. And if you look to mammalian evolution, you would look at 1, or maybe if you got incredibly lucky, 2. And the result of that is that every step of evolutionary theory, if it's driven strictly by chance, must result in something that is enough improved that natural selection can act on it and say, this is so much better, the old one dies off. And if that's 3 nucleotides at a time for bacteria and 2 nucleotides at a time or less for humans, that's not enough information in each of those steps to actually get anything significant. We don't have enough statistical odds. The analogy I often use to portray this one, I actually have been reading Harry Potter to my daughter. She's really into it right now. So I've been using that as an analogy. If you take the first couple lines of Harry Potter and you try to evolve those 2 lines into the entire first book, changing usually 2, but occasionally 3 letters at a time, can you make the whole book? And then after you've made that first book, take that first book and change usually 1, but every now and again, you can change 2 letters. But each of those steps must result in a narrative that is so much more compelling. They put the old edition out of print and they only print the new one so it's so much better of a story. It's a laughable hypothesis that something could even be accomplished like that. And yet that's actually an easier task than it would be for the evolution of the complex organisms we see on Earth today. Now, if you have a theistic evolution perspective that says there's some other designer behind it, you can overcome some of those issues there. But from a purely naturalistic point of view, that's an insurmountable problem that cannot possibly be accomplished there. And lest this be merely a negative argument, it's also worth pointing out, what are we saying exists in both of these systems? In that first replicating system and in these complex organisms, we're looking at information in DNA. And that's what's universally agreed upon, is that we have information. And if you can't explain it through other means, what you should ask is, what are our known sources of information? And the only known source of information is intelligence. Anytime we see information, even minuscule amounts of information, we say an intelligence made that some way, somehow. And this massively more information points not just through negative arguments about chance being not a good enough explanation, but also the positive arguments that that information betrays the necessity of an intelligent creator. So those would be a few directly from mine. I could go on much longer on that, but I want to make sure there's time. There are other questions as well, but those are some that directly point from my area of study to the evidence for a creator God.
Wonderful, Dr. Schott. Thank you for sharing that. I would like to open it to our attendees to ask questions. To our student leaders, Dr. Furco, if you would also like to add in and ask some questions to our speakers, and this could be just a very non-formal conversation where attendees, if you would like to raise your hand and unmute yourself for a question, that will be great. Or you can add your question to the chat feature.
Yeah, I'll throw a question in here. So for both of you, you both went to, well, Patrick, I know you went to Christian college for undergrad, but when did you start thinking like deeply about these issues? Like when did it start to come together between math and faith, or between studying science and faith, that you started thinking, okay, there's more overlap here than just being separate fields? Was that something that you didn't start thinking about till you became a faculty member? Was it something you thought about in high school, maybe even younger? I mean, where did those thoughts start coming in for each of you?
I'll go ahead and start. We could probably alternate who goes first, kind of thing, so we're not always pausing and seeing who's going to go first. But so for me, actually, from fairly early on, got very interested in these topics. I didn't mention earlier, but related to when I became a Christian when I was 5 years old. Was raised in a Christian home, always went to church, and got interested in that on a personal level very early on. I remember growing up, seeing my mom, and even going over to my grandparents' house, seeing my grandma with the kitchen table covered in, here's the Bible, but then here's also a Bible dictionary, and here's a Greek dictionary, and here's a Hebrew dictionary, and here's a Strong's Concordance, and here's 3 commentaries, and literally barely fit on the kitchen table to put all the resources there. So by junior high, I had learned how to use all those resources to study the Bible there. And then by high school, getting a lot more into apologetics types things of, I remember going to conferences on apologetics related to Mormonism and apologetics related to science and faith issues. So for me, that started very early on. It was something, my mom was very passionate about the digging into scripture itself. And my dad was more passionate, he's a structural engineer, about evidence for design and coming from that side. So some on my own, some with my Bible teachers in high school. I went to a private Christian high school, and then also some with my dad as well, getting involved in those topics. And then really seeing that deepen in college as I got to see at a much more foundational level how those ideas integrate. But for me, it started early, but I'd say the majority of that formed during college. And then even in grad school, it was a secular grad school, but I was deliberately continuing to find outside influences. I did a lot of podcasts during grad school and a lot of audiobooks on science faith topics to make sure that as I was learning all of my essential scientific data, I was continuing to also grow in my philosophical and theological knowledge of how that integrates into science and faith issues.
For me, as a math major, I mean, I was already a Christian, a practicing Christian, right around the time that I said I would probably started categorizing myself anyway as a non-denominational Christian. Right around that time, I was taking my courses as an undergrad math major. And then I took one course. I had not seen really a conflict between math and faith. Just to me personally, it didn't make sense that there was a conflict. But I started to think more deeply about the connections when I took advanced calculus or intro to real analysis, which, by the way, I have a few students. I just noticed here on the attendance list here that there's a few students from that class. When I took that class, it helped me understand just how independent math is from us. It kind of, as some of the young kids would say today, blew my mind, because I had not stopped to think that deeply about how independent math is. We create names for the mathematical ideas and structures and concepts and objects, but math kind of is. I can't really force or bend math to do something, as people typically say in conversations. 2 + 2 is 4, and you can't change that. And so in a course like Advanced Calculus or Intro to Real Analysis, I noticed that everything starts from a few faith assumptions, just a few assumptions that you make. We call them in mathematics axioms. And then from those assumptions, everything comes from there. Everything self-builds, if you will. And so I saw a relationship between how we in the faith also start from a few fundamental assumptions and everything builds on that. But also, I just saw that if math is timeless and it's its own thing, no one invented it, why is it there? Why does it work? And so that's when I would say the deeper questions started making their way in. At first, I just was a student that thought, well, math and faith, yeah, there's no conflict there. But then I started thinking more deeply about those connections. That's how it worked for me.
Thank you for sharing that. Who would like to ask a question?
I'll go. So, Dr. Cordero, Dr. Schott, one of the questions that Cabrina and I had for you was, how do you respond when people say that science contradicts the Bible?
Yeah, so what I would say is that, one, if you take a survey of scientists throughout the world, you would find that the majority of scientists are theists of some form. So this narrative and this notion that science is not compatible with religious belief is incorrect, both by just empirical evidence based on surveys, but also historically. The second thing, getting more specific, the Bible and science, I would say that of course, the perception that underlies that typically is the discussion between the first couple of chapters in Genesis, what school of interpretation you are in those, and your knowledge of physics and evolutionary biology. So when a student brings this up, I say, well, okay, look, there could be conflict depending on what your assumptions are about each of these. And in reality, in a very quick conversation with a student or a person about this, what I'll say is, look, there's a spectrum. Even in my department and in Dr. Schott's department, there is a spectrum of different positions from Christians within the sciences. And to suggest that there's only room for one of those positions, I think it's a little far-fetched. So that's the short answer. But I'll let Dr. Schott add to that because I know he and I share very similar thoughts on this.
Yeah, Dr. Cordero and I actually, when we had our impromptu, not quite fire drill, but fire run out to the front lawn the other day, and had a conversation. And this is a point that we've said, we want to make sure we get to talk about this one at some point. Just to point out that there is a spectrum of belief. I read a lot with William Lane Craig as one of my more philosophical resources. And something that I admire in his approach is he always talks about, here is the scope of orthodoxy. You can have this belief, this belief, this belief, or this belief, and all of those fall within Orthodox Christianity. Now, if you go all the way out here, you're a heretic, and if you go all the way out here, you're a heretic. But I think oftentimes when this is the scope of orthodoxy, we say, I believe here, and if you're right there, I don't trust you anymore. And that's not really healthy. That's not what biblical evidence says here. Now, certainly there's a true answer to this, and there are disagreements, and somebody's right and somebody's wrong, but it's not necessarily of what I would say salvific importance. So to put a fine point on the origin side, there are broadly speaking three theistic views. You could have young earth creationism that says the earth was created and all the creatures in it roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. Roughly how we see them today with only modest evolution. You could have old earth creationism, which says the earth was created through the Big Bang. And then after that, at some point, either at one point or multiple points, God created creatures on that earth. Or you could have theistic evolution, which says God created the universe with the Big Bang and then used evolution to create the creatures within that, and multiple subviews to each of these, whether that first creature was a special act of creation or was a perfectly situated, whether he manipulated things to help it evolve at the right time, or if he set up things just right so they would happen that way. There's many sub-views within each of those, but I think all three of those views fall within orthodoxy. And so when I look at that, oftentimes what I see people saying, oh, there's a conflict between science and faith, they've taken a very narrow definition of what Christian faith could be. And they've taken a very narrow definition of what science might suggest. And they've said, well, those two don't match. The problem is science addresses all these issues and faith has all these issues. And there's a lot of overlap in between that certain ones are incompatible. But within general Christianity and general evidence from science, I don't see any fundamental incompatibility. So my first question when I get this question is to ask back, well, what do you mean by that? And there's a book that I read in high school or college, I think college, called Questioning Evangelism, that was not about questioning whether we should evangelize, but doing evangelism by asking questions. And oftentimes merely turning the question back, say, well, what evidence do you have that they do conflict? And suddenly they just say, oh, I just always heard they did. Oh, well, that's not an argument. You're just parroting something else because you've heard it's true. That doesn't mean anything. And there are so many different things that could be meant by that, that you want to answer the question they're asking and not go off in a rabbit trail that makes them think you know nothing about what they're talking about. One area that I do see people bring up a lot that I would address specifically is the issue of miracles, that many will say that the natural sciences preclude miracles. And this is a topic, actually, I gave a seminar on it about a year ago, looking at Lee Strobel's book on the case for miracles, that goes through that philosophically Hume's arguments against miracles fail. Scientifically, there's no scientific data that says miracles can't happen. Science is only able to say there is no natural explanation for this. So either it can't happen or it's of supernatural origin. And it can't preclude either of those unless you have presupposed naturalism, which is not a scientific assumption. So you have to have some other philosophical reason to think there is no God to argue against miracles. But that's probably one of the most common objections. Well, miracles are unscientific. No, they're not. They're, in fact, actually a scientific analysis of things like swoon theory that was attempted to use to explain away the resurrection of Jesus proves swoon theory is absolutely scientifically untenable. But the biblical account of what happened to Jesus is absolutely scientifically reasonable, so long as a supernatural God intervened to resurrect Jesus from the dead, while swoon theory is scientifically empty. So science can be applied even to miraculous things to show validity of these cases, rather than thinking that science disproves the possibility of miracles.
Thank you for that. And then kind of in the same vein, do you have any recommended reading sources for people who are looking to kind of gain their knowledge basis and figure out what they think about all these different issues like young earth, old earth, resurrection, everything like that?
So I could have gone on way too long on this. So I'm going to try to narrow myself a little bit. About age of the universe issues, I recommend a short book called 7 Days That Divide the World by Lennox, the mathematician Lennox. So sorry, Ricardo, if I stole one of yours that you were going to recommend. But I know we both like Lennox a lot. And he does a good job diving into theological interpretations of Genesis and implications regarding age of the universe. In terms of biochemistry and complexity of life, Michael Behe's 2017 book, Darwin Devolves, is a phenomenal work that goes through some of what I talked about in terms of how fast we can evolve, but also points out that if it's a strictly unguided process, the rate at which things degrade exceeds the rate at which by random chance things could improve. And therefore, any natural Darwinian evolution is insufficient to explain the amount of information there. In terms of general apologetics, Frank Turek has a great book called Stealing from God that talks about a lot of the philosophical assumptions related to theism versus atheism that are unjustified as atheism. And William Lane Craig's On Guard is phenomenal on that as well. And I haven't finished it yet because it came out Monday, but Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, I've got through half of it already, which I guess in 4 days, that's a decent amount to have gotten through at that point. But I'm loving it. And it's an excellent kind of tour de force of arguments from origin of the universe, fine-tuning of the universe, and complexity in biology, the biological information that all point to a creator God who is involved with his creation. It's looking to be a very excellent book. And Dr. Cordero, I'm almost to the chapter on multiverse and alternate theories there. So I was that close to like, oh, I'm going to get to the Cordero once. I didn't finish that chapter before we started, but I've been very impressed by that as well. But lots of great resources out there, depending on what area you're looking for.
Patrick is absolutely right. He did steal one of my resources. Dr. Lennox, John Lennox, a mathematician, he became very popular for debating Richard Dawkins for a while. But also the book he suggested, 7 Days That Divide the World. It's a good survey. And what I like about that book, as Dr. Schott was saying, is that he doesn't try to convince you of one perspective about the 7 days of Genesis. He just does a good job at showing you the history of the interpretations, the possibility of the interpretations. So that's a great book to start with. Another book, in terms of the more philosophical aspects of applied mathematics, it depends on how philosophical you want to get. But one of the books that I like a lot, just for math and faith together, many years ago, recommended by one of our professors here. There's a book called Mathematics Through the Eyes of Faith, and this book was written by James Bradley and Russell Howell. And it's kind of also a survey of a whole literature of faith and mathematics. And there's various chapters. One deals with beauty, one deals with the dimensions, or dimensionality and how that fits into the universe. And then one deals with ontology of mathematics, which is what I'm interested in, the philosophy of the existence of mathematics. Does math exist? Do we discover it? Did we invent it? All that good stuff. So that book is, for those of you that are math majors here, I highly encourage you. And for those of you that are math majors here, last year you saw one of the authors. Dr. Russell Howell was here for a distinguished lecture series that we had a little over a year ago here at CBU, right before things shut down. So those would be two great books that I would recommend, because again, both authors for those books are mathematicians.
Thank you. Amazing recommendations. I also want to encourage you, I want to give you some more time, but I would encourage you attendees to raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask questions. This is open space for you to ask any questions that you might have, and go ahead. Carissa has a question. I'll be reading that out loud. Drs. Schott and Cordero, please feel free to answer. Have you ever came across something in your field of study as a believer and it created doubt to your faith foundation? Or has the discoveries in your field push you to a heavier belief? And I believe probably like being closer to God through that discovery. Wonderful question. Thank you.
Great question, Carissa. For me personally, I would say, let me say this. My family is not Christian. No one in my family is Christian, not in my direct family. And I got the same question from my stepmother halfway through grad school, or about 3/4 into grad school, working on my PhD. I went back home to Puerto Rico to visit my family, and we were having dinner. And she basically said, look, now that you've gone through all this, right, and you do your research in this area, and do you really still believe in God? That's a similar question to what Carissa asked. And I'm not going to judge anyone who has gone through that. For some people, that has been the case. For me personally, what I just found was more and more, as I looked into the applications of Schrodinger equations, more and more the fascinating mathematical nature of the universe. And so if anything, it gave me a greater sense of awe. But I say that very carefully because I don't want to create the impression that we're not supposed to experience doubts. I'll say this, when I have experienced doubts, they haven't been because of mathematics. They've been maybe because of other more philosophical questions or moral questions, if I have in the past experienced doubts. And I think doubts are opportunities for growth in faith. Definitely, right? I love that one of the people in the Gospels says to Jesus, when Jesus says, "Do you believe?" He says, "I believe, help my unbelief." What a profound expression of, yes, I have faith, but I'm kind of doubtful too. And Jesus rewards that little bit of mixed faith. So I don't want to give the sense that doubt is bad. Mathematics personally for me has never done that. It has always just increased more and more my sense of awe for God. I think that's important historically, because when you talk to an atheist or someone who's a naturalist about the fact that in the history of mathematics, mathematicians have been Christians, the great ones of the past, the typical response that I've gotten from some of my friends is, well, everyone was a Christian back then. Everyone was a Christian back then. And they seem to imply that as we get closer to our current time, the more knowledge you have, the more that you would say, no, there is no God. But all we've done throughout the centuries from a mathematical perspective is discover that the universe is way more mathematical than we thought. Even let's say that you buy string theory, which I'm not qualified to say if I am I'm not a string theorist. I've dealt with quantum mechanics, but not with string theory. Even if you accept string theory, the universe is even more mathematical than we can even, it'll leave us scratching our heads. Jim Gates, who's one of the pioneers of string theory, said that in string theory, in superstring theory, you can find a code embedded in the universe similar to a computer code back from the 60s. What the heck is a computer-like code doing embedded in the fabric of reality? So again, what I see is that as mathematicians continue to progress, we discover more and more the disturbingly mathematical nature of the universe. So no questions from math for me, no doubts from math for me, but definitely have I had moments of doubt due to other reasons in my past? Yes. And I love that Jesus takes my imperfection and walks me through it. He leads me out of the valley of the shadow of death. So that's it for me. Dr. Schott?
Yeah, I think similarly, I wouldn't say there was any point at which I said, oh, this makes me question my faith. But there are definitely points I've had where it made me reevaluate aspects of it. One area would be specifically, I grew up and was generally a very dogmatic young earth creationist. And I actually have some regrets from some of that time, not because of my belief system, but because of the way in which I believed it, where I questioned the faith of someone who didn't share young earth creationism as their worldview, and questioned whether someone who was an old earth or a theistic evolutionist whether they were really a Christian based on that belief. And that led me to a very dogmatic and literalistic interpretation of some things that then when I confronted scientific data that said, but wait, that doesn't seem to quite fit the data as well. How do I deal with that? Now, it wasn't a crisis of faith, but it was something that made me kind of reevaluate, what do I do with this? What is actually essential here? And that did result in a shift as I looked at the data and I studied more of the theology side of it as well, that I had many people who I respected who were old earth creationists, but I had always thought, well, I like everything else about you, but I think you're wrong on that point. And then over time realized, okay, well, maybe they have some good arguments within that, and that I'm being overly dogmatic in my perspective on that. And again, still hold that I have friends who are young earth creationists. I have no problem with that. I have friends who are theistic evolutionists. I have no problem with that either. I think that's all within the spectrum of orthodoxy there. But that did lead to some issues there. In terms of overall faith, I would say one area that I continue to look at, but I think it's one I need to study more because I'm not convinced there's as much evidence as it looks at, would be the idea of synteny within genomics. Synteny refers to the general idea of genome organization being similar from one organism to another, proportional to how far apart they are in evolutionary history. And what we look at on there is some of synteny that is explained away by poor early builds that use not the best scaffolds. But there's also some evidence of synteny that persists now that we've resolved those issues, and how much of them explains which aspect. Now, that wouldn't actually be a crisis of faith because that would be a old earth versus theistic evolution issue, which I still find falls within faith. But it is something that does make me reevaluate aspects of my worldview. I look also, though, at the totality of it, and I say, there's a couple little snippets here and there where I say, I'm not sure on this one, and I'm not sure on that one, but it's well, I've got 2 or 3 pieces over here and 200 or 300 pieces over here in favor of faith. So I don't find the totality of it, because any argument for God, I think, is largely what we'd call an adductive argument rather than a deductive argument. We cannot make a case, I think, from science that would say this conclusively proves God or this conclusively disproves God. It's rather on the preponderance of the evidence which is most plausible. And I've never had a point where the evidence for not God exceeds the evidence for God. In fact, it's always been very strongly that there was more evidence for God than not God throughout what I've been aware of there. But I think there's one other point that's really important, and that is we're not limited to just our scientific data when we evaluate this. We can also look at historical data, we can look at philosophical data, and we can even look at the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. That with the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, even if you lived in a time where there were more scientific questions that might lead to difficulties there, the testimony of the Holy Spirit is a real thing. And that's a factor as well in our decision making. Not that we need that instead of our evidence or in spite of the evidence, but it's something there in addition to it that we could know apart from that evidence, also have good evidence that there was a God through non-scientific means as well.
I want to add something, just continuing the conversation, such great points that Dr. Schott made there about outside of science. Because one thing that the culture of apologetics has noticed, and probably intentionally done, is that there's been a shift in the approach to apologetics. There's kind of an old school of apologetics which deals with a lot of what we've been discussing here, which is intelligent design. The universe had a beginning and things like that. That's the old school of apologetics. Timothy Keller, renowned preacher and pastor, he wrote a book about 10 years ago called Making Sense of God. And this book was a follow, as many books were, to A Secular Age, a book written by Chuck Taylor. And since that book and since Timothy Keller's book, there's been a new approach to apologetics, which is to address some of the questions that are more philosophical in nature. For example, how do I, from a strictly naturalistic perspective, can I account for meaning in life, for my call for justice, for morality, for identity, for hope, and explanations to what love is, right? If just left to naturalistic explanations, and love is just biochemical reactions that, make us more suitable for survival. And so there's a lot of important questions that need to be answered philosophically, not just scientifically, for which God much better fits the description. As Dr. Schott said, science can't prove or disprove God. So then I think we turn to other types of questions to then help us lean in some directions about the existence of God. And again, that's been kind of the new approach of apologetics to address some of the issues, the cry for justice, the cry for hope. If we're, just to give you an example, if we're left in a universe where there is no God, then the universe is going to end up in the heat death of the universe, as some physicists would say, following some of the current Big Bang implications. And so that means that kind of everything is pointless if there is no God, because ultimately we all will cease to exist. Even as a human race, our legacies will mean nothing. This is powerful implications and disturbing implications in a godless universe, but a theistic universe, a universe in which God works to achieve redemption and to achieve justice and to achieve a new heaven and a new earth. That's a lot more satisfying, and it explains more these things that our souls cry for: freedom, identity, hope, justice, satisfaction, meaning. So yeah, great point. I just wanted to add that to that.
Mind if I throw one more thing on there to kind of dovetail on what you were saying there? Ethics was actually one that I had put. I had kind of taken some notes on the questions that were asked beforehand. And ethics is an issue that I think also really strongly points towards that. I think you mentioned that in there, the morality aspect. From a scientist perspective, fraud in publishing is almost the worst crime you can commit as a scientist. You lose all credibility as a scientist to have ever committed a fraud in publishing something. And there's also, I think, a valid push for diversity and equality in gender and race within science, and to oppose discrimination, despite what Francis Crick James Watson has promoted of, there being differences between races in mental capacities. And there's been vehement outcries against that as being evil. And I think they are justified in thinking that discrimination on race and gender and things like this are evil things. But the problem is that's not something science can tell us. And certainly it's something that naturalism can't even sustain. The basic argument there is that if there is no God, there's no moral lawgiver. And if there's no moral lawgiver, anything that we might call morality is a subjective morality that's relative to ourselves, rather than an objective morality that applies to all individuals. So if that's the case, if morality is merely subjective, then the sexism present in researchers who discovered DNA but ignored their female grad student who did a lot of the work and didn't give her any credit, nothing wrong with that, because the majority of them were male and they had the power to do it. They were doing the right thing for their era. Or even worse still, you go back to the 1800s and the slave owners who were oppressing Black individuals in America. Well, they were the majority and they were in power and they were right to do it. Or you go even more recent to Hitler and you say the genocide he committed wasn't wrong. It was just unfortunate for him he wasn't successful, because if he was successful, he would have been right in committing genocide if morality is purely subjective and established by either might or majority. So the only way to escape saying Hitler's genocide and the slavery of the past and even the racism of today are merely preferences on par with liking vanilla or chocolate ice cream better, to say anything stronger than that, you have to appeal to the existence of a God, like this general new apologetics that pushes more for not merely a scientific side, but also things that we genuinely know to be true, that have deep implications in the way we interact with the world.
Amazing points. As an instructor myself that I teach science and math, introductory science and math classes, I'm always challenged by the question of what is God trying to teach us through our understanding of chemistry, for instance, and how do we translate that to our students? I know this is a very broad question, as there are many ways that you can integrate faith into your teachings, and whether it is in applied mathematics or in chemistry and biochemistry. What can you tell us today, as we sum up our session, as a note on, in a summed up way, what is God trying to teach us through your areas and of discipline? In a summed up way, what is God trying to show us about His creation as we explore biochemistry and applied math?
I think in one thing, it would display his brilliance and intelligence with just how brilliantly and complexly designed we are, is one aspect of that. I think another thing is that there's just so many fundamental things about the way things work. I was teaching on entropy a couple of weeks ago that just clearly say the universe had a beginning, which means there was a universe had a beginner who started the universe, which is there is a creator. But also I think another aspect of science is it allows us to realize that there is a difference between a paradox and a contradiction. So when we talk about things like light, is light a particle or is it a wave? Well, yes, in some ways it acts like a particle and in some ways it acts like a wave, but that doesn't mean that because we don't fully understand it, light doesn't exist. And similarly, when we look at deep things about theology, like what is the Trinity? How is God three in one? Or what is the incarnate Christ? How is he both fully God and fully man? Those are paradoxes which we cannot fully explain, but the fact that they are paradoxes is a distinct thing from a contradiction. Because if we're to reject the idea and say, because it's a paradox that Jesus could be fully God and fully man, or because it's a paradox that God could be three in one, we would also have to say light isn't a real thing either, because it's a paradox that we can't fully explain. So I think when we look at models within how we explain things and the limits of our understanding, what we understand betrays a brilliant creator who designed our world so well, but it also betrays that even all the greatest minds throughout history so far have been unable to fully explain some aspects of it. And that doesn't mean they don't exist. That doesn't mean they're inexplicable. It just means we're limited in our knowledge, and we need to have a humility as we approach what we're looking at and not think ourselves wiser than we are and become fools in that process.
For me, I take this approach to integration that I hope is a little more broad than just mathematics. And so I hope that I can provide an answer that's broader than mathematics. I believe faith integration fundamentally works at two levels. The first one is that in some way, my discipline leads me to worship God. It leads me to awe and wonder of God. Secondly, how I implement and practice my discipline changes as a Christian. And so those are the two primary things. So for example, I'm an applied mathematician. So I care about mathematics at the first level because it leads me to the awe and wonder of God, kind of a la Romans 1:20. And then secondly, now when I do applied math projects, when I choose to solve a real world problem, I'm no longer seeking to solve a real world problem just because it's fun. I am seeking to solve a real world problem because I am loving my neighbor that way. And so it leads me.
You muted yourself, Ricardo.
Sorry, I didn't realize I muted myself. So as I was saying, at the second level, when I'm practicing the application, the research of mathematics, again, I want to solve problems that are relevant to helping my neighbor, not just because they're interesting mathematically. And so it leads me to consider projects I might have not considered had I not been a Christian. Overall, I think now let's step back. Let's step away from academia. The problem of integration is a problem that concerns us all. We all have a tendency to compartmentalize faith outside of our lives. And recently, I've been writing on this subject. Look at Peter. If you follow what's considered to be a chronological order of events in the Gospels, you see that the moment when Peter fetches all these fish out of the ocean, where Jesus tells him to test the other side with his nets, that wasn't the first encounter. Peter had met him before. Jesus had been to Peter's house and had healed his mother. Now watch this. Jesus had performed a supernatural act, healing Peter's mother-in-law, not his mother-in-law, I believe, heals his mother-in-law. And then a chapter later, I think it's in Mark or Luke, I can't remember right now, a chapter later, the moment comes where Peter is asked by Jesus to go and find fish. And what does Peter do? He's like, I've been doing this all day. What are you talking about? He compartmentalized his faith. He had witnessed Jesus healing his mother-in-law, but now in his trade, in his discipline, fishing, in his trade of fishing, he had compartmentalized Jesus out. This doesn't apply here. And that's something we all do, whether we're in academia or not, whether we're in mathematics or in sciences, we tend to bring Jesus out, but we're called to hold every thought captive to Christ. We're taught that, again, every aspect we do of our lives, we do to the glory of God. And so even the fisherman, even the plumber should see their trades as beautiful analogies of the gospel and as opportunities to preach the gospel. We can't fall as Peter did. Renewal of the mind is to constantly remind ourselves, I'm compartmentalizing like Peter. No, I need to realize who Jesus is, and it works in my trade.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schott and Dr. Cordero. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. I'm very happy that you were able to join us on the opening dialogue between science and faith. If you have any questions, please contact us. You do have the email in the invite, in the Zoom invite, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions, and we can forward them to our speakers. You will receive a follow-up email with a recording for today's webinar within 24 to 48 hours, hopefully. And finally, on behalf of the ASA CBU local chapter and our presenters, we would like to thank you again and have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Hey, let me come in with one last thing before everybody gets off. I noticed Dana's on with us as well. Dana helps to coordinate all the local chapters of the ASA throughout the United States. And one thing that we didn't note on here is that we are part of a national organization, and the student memberships are free. So Dana, can you come on and just say a little bit about joining the ASA and just a little bit about the organization, maybe?
Sure. All of our student members are free. It's gratis, so you can go to our website to get more information. We do have a premier student membership that allows you to have a copy of the journal. So if you're interested in that, you can give me an email, send me a quick message, and I can give you a code that will get you that premier. And my email is dana@asa3.org.
And we'll also, I know FOT has the membership list, so we'll send out a link to the ASA and also a link to joining the group, the organization as well. And this is, like I said, we are local chapter, official local chapter at CBU. It's a campus chapter, so it's open to students, staff, faculty, basically anybody, not only at CBU, but also in the entire Riverside area, Inland Empire, and we have a Southern California chapter as well, and then other members throughout Southern California, throughout California and the U.S. So just wanted to put that plug out there as well. So Dr. Zaidan, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close us up again.
Thank you, Dr. Furco, for adding that. Wonderful. I just added a link to the chat for how you can access the ASA site. Thank you, Dana, for adding your contact information as well. And specifically on that site, you'll be able to join the ASA as a member. Thank you. Dr. Schott, did you
Can I just throw out one little quick comment as well, is to say, I think I spoke for Dr. Cordero as well. This is a subject that we're very passionate about. And I get excited when students drop by my office and say, hey, I want to talk about these issues. I don't see that as oh no, it's disrupting my day that I don't have time to go do this. I see that as, oh, cool, I get to do the best part of my job. So if you have follow-up questions that you want to continue this conversation, I know that you guys are hosting future events. Continue to be involved in those. Those would be great events. Also, feel free to just show up at our offices, or COVID's a weird time. You may want to email us in advance of the semester, but even in general, knock and see if we happen to be there. We love to talk about these things, and we want to see students who care about them and want to dig into these ideas. Please feel welcome to come and ask questions that if you didn't want to ask them in front of 25 of your peers, but you're comfortable asking it one-on-one, come ask. We want to have those conversations.
Thank you again. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you again in future events. Thank you.